Welcome back to Waves by Factory Berlin and Beats by Dr. Dre. I'm Jill Beytin.
I'm Julia Joubert.
And we're from Bear Radio, which is Berlin's English language podcasting network and label.
And we've been getting into the fundamentals of podcasting. In the previous episode, we spoke a little bit about how to hone in on your idea and your topic. And in today's, we're going to be talking about creating a podcast outline and developing a roadmap. So there's some questions that you really should be asking yourself as you start creating this podcast outline. There is a lot that goes into making a podcast. It's not just simply having an idea, getting the recording equipment, and then going for it. If you really want this to be a project that is worth your while, worth your time, the energy, the money that you spend, there's some critical points that you have to consider before you dive in.
So the first thing that you really need to think about, and we will reiterate this a million times throughout this series, is why do you want to make this podcast? Is it just something you thought about in a park while you were drunk with your friends and you're like, that's a good idea, I want to be on the radio? Or is there actually something that you think you can contribute to the conversation?
I want to be on the radio.
I want to be on the radio, which is why I got into it, and look at me now. So the next thing you want to think about is, what is this podcast going to be about? What are you making?
Yeah. So why and what is it about are two critical starting points. So all the things we're going to get into now, you need to answer those questions first. Because if you don't know why you're making it or what it's about, then you probably won't yet be considering a name. But a name is very important. A name is like when you name your child. It's not a real baby unless you name it. That's not true. Maybe if you were Elon Musk and Grimes. Is that?
X1AE1247.
Great name. But naming your podcast is really helpful in kind of making it real for you. You're no longer just telling people about this podcast that you're making. This podcast has a name. It potentially has cover art as well. It's a lot of fun to do. It can also be really stressful. So I would recommend doing it with a friend. I think having somebody there to kind of bounce things off of, draft up a whole collection of potential names, and together sit there and figure this out. Speaking of friends or strangers, another thing that you would want to do right at the very beginning is kind of develop an elevator pitch, which is, for those who don't know, it's like a 10 to 15 second description of what your podcast is about. If you can kind of establish that why, and you can summarize it in an elevator ride with a complete stranger, you're probably onto something. And then you want to start thinking about, how long do I actually want to run this thing for? So Jill was saying, if you're looking at episodes specifically, do you want it to be 2 minutes? We're purists when it comes to podcasting, so a 2-minute episode kind of upsets us.
Yeah.
A 4-hour-long one upsets us too. But I will admit there are some very successful podcasts here in Germany that have 4-hour-long episodes and have listeners coming back time and time again. So the length of the episode is obviously something to consider. In addition to that is, how long do you actually want this thing to run for? Do you want it to carry on for the rest of your life? Do you want it to be a 6-part mini-series? Do you want it to be something like Serial, for example, which started out with just, 12, 15 episodes, and then they were onto something really good and kept making more of them. If you've decided that this is going to be a lifelong project for you, you could see yourself potentially speaking about this forever. And I did touch on this in the previous installment of Waves, but what is this thing that you're going to speak about? What is the topic? And do you see yourself doing it for the rest of your life? That is your unique ability, your expert coming together to form a topic. But it's important then to consider, what's actually going to keep me motivated? Is the topic itself the motivation? Is my interest in learning more the motivation? You need to start sourcing out these things, because your motivation can't just be, your mom phoning you on a daily basis telling you you're doing great. It works for some, not for everyone.
Yeah. And you also need to start sourcing the people who are going to be on your team. Will you be working with a producer? Do you want to be the producer and you want someone to be a host? Are you going to have someone who helps you with editing or marketing? There's a lot of people you can probably get help from in your regular life.
I will just add to that, and I think that that's we're doing this here in Berlin, but quite specifically for here, and I know compared to the South African landscape, there is such a beautiful culture of people helping people here in Germany and in Berlin specifically, that if you just reach out to those communities and you say, hey, this is the project I'm creating, would anybody be willing to collaborate with me? I can promise you without a doubt, you will have somebody who would be willing to do sound design for you, who would be willing to help teach you edit, who would be willing to help you produce. Because everybody seems to be very keen on projects and creation and teamwork. And it's not the dog-eat-dog kind of space that you think podcasting might actually be. There's a really, really cool unit. Again, I will say specifically here in Berlin. I can't speak for the whole world.
And there's a lot of these communities online. If you're looking for someone to even just help you with cover art, there might be an artist out there who's willing to make something for you. And you also need to think about recording equipment, which we'll get into in a later installment of this series.
So say you've figured out your topic, you have got somebody to help you do it, you have invested in the equipment that you can afford, you've now recorded these things. Where are you going to put them? Are you going to have a website that is specifically just for your podcast and that's the only place people can find them? Is it potentially behind a paywall? Is it available on Apple Podcasts or other streaming services? These are all things that you need to consider, and also highly advised to look into hosting platforms that distribute to everything for you. Back in the day, you had to find every hosting site and upload to every single one individually. A nightmare. Now there are places that do it for you as well. So do your research on that and it'll make your life a whole lot easier.
You'll also need to think about what will keep your audience engaged. What's going to keep them coming back to your podcast 10 or 15 episodes in? Speaking of which, are you able to think of 10 or 15 episodes of your podcast? If it's not going to be anything more than a 3-part series, maybe you should pivot your idea a bit.
Now, I touched on this before, and it's probably my favorite thing because I have a very much like a love-hate relationship with naming a podcast. But naming a podcast is essential because, you know, that turns into your brand. And you have to be very careful and selective when you come up with this name, because if you've decided to make it more than a 6-part series, you're going to be stuck with this baby for quite a while. So you've got 3 options if we're going to break them down into 3 simple options. The one is the clever name. The second is a descriptive name. And the third is your own name. So with the clever name, I am all for a good pun. I love a good pun. But if the pun has absolutely nothing to do with the topic at hand, it's going to be very difficult for potential listeners to find you. A lot of listeners are not going to actually read the description. They're just going to be attracted either by your cover art or the name of the podcast and hope it's something that they're into. So it still needs to be searchable.
Yeah.
Then with the descriptive name, I think we can go to the flip side with that. Sometimes it just becomes a bit too wordy. If your name is running onto like line 2, line 3 of your Apple Podcast description, you've probably got a name that's a bit too long. So avoid being too wordy, keep it nice and succinct. And then lastly, your own name. If you are a big name in your field of interest and with the topic that you're speaking about, if you're like a really successful author or a journalist who's written for a number of stations, or if you're Dr. Dre and people know you, then sure, go ahead and make a podcast with your own name. But if you're just getting started, people don't really know who you are, they don't know what you're about, you know, just Julia Joubert's podcast, not yet because I'll be famous one day. But Julia Joubert's podcast is not really going to tell people anything about who I am or what I do.
And there are some other things to consider when you're naming a podcast. The thing is, I've met people here in Berlin who will tell me they have a podcast, and then they'll say, it's fine, I've had it for 3 years, it's a stupid name.
I'm not going to listen to that podcast.
It's not going to excite me to listen to your podcast.
No.
And then going off the back of what Julia was just saying, you do want to make it SEO friendly. If you're making a podcast about banana bread, use keywords like walnuts, spices, baking.
Banana
spread. You want it to be accurate, and you also don't want to use so much insider language. If you have a podcast that's, say, on a really specific computer hacking topic, and you use really specific jargon that only you and your friends know, you might want to broaden it a little bit to maybe let it be more easy for people to stumble upon your podcast.
I do want to just give the flip side of that, where I do think it is important in some cases, in most cases, to use insider language and keywords, but make sure that they are commonly used.
Yeah.
Don't just hop onto thesaurus.com and try and find the most obscure version of a word because it's unique. Yes, it might be unique, but half of us who speak that language are probably not going to know what you're actually talking about. So definitely use keywords, definitely make it specific to what you're speaking about, but make it as universal as possible while staying unique. Does that, that's two polar opposites, but find like the nice happy medium in the middle.
I hear ya.
For example, I think I watched Star Wars once when I was 12.
Same.
Don't hate me. Star Wars was not my thing.
It's okay.
I know Jabba the Hutt. Is that even how you say it? I don't know. Anyway, Star Wars is great. It exists, and I clearly know about it. Even somebody like me knows what Star Wars is. Okay, so this is the point I'm trying to make. So there is a podcast, for example, called Rebel Force Radio. I know 100% that is a Star Wars podcast. Same goes for Coffee with Kenobi. Now again, I don't know anything, but I know for sure that this is a Star Wars podcast. Would I listen to it? Probably not, because I'll feel left out, but I'll know exactly what it's about.
A lot of people also always ask us how long their podcast episode should be. And the long and short of it is that your podcast should be as long as it needs to be without leaving anything out, but without also boring your audience.
Yeah. Basically, it needs to be as long as it should be without being any longer or shorter, which we know sounds
very subjective,
incredibly obscure. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you're getting the highest quality content into each episode or into your entire series as you go. So if you have found that usually you average on like a 45-minute episode, but this time around you have 20 minutes of really good audio, really good coverage, you've start to finish, you've kind of told your story in those 20 minutes, then leave it at those 20 minutes. You don't want to fluff it out with unnecessary stuff, just like you don't want to cut out really good things if it's too long, because people will notice and they will be upset or disappointed. So we did mention before these like 4-hour-long episodes. Here in Germany, they're incredibly successful. But if you have something like a 4-hour episode and your listeners are used to only having an hour, consider breaking it into 4 different installments. And it's that age-old thing of like, you know, kind of fit in with what the average is, but if the average doesn't work for you, make it work for you as best as possible. Because if we had to take all of the best songs off of Apple iTunes in the whole world and put them all together and then divide it to find the average, and you found that the average song, the perfect best ever song was 2 minutes 32 seconds, you would miss out on some incredible music because you've tried to fit in with what everybody else has made. So we'd have no Bohemian Rhapsody. And we want you to be the Bohemian Rhapsody of podcasting.
It's true. And also people always ask us how often they should release. And what I always say is it doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent and dependable. Once a month is fine, every 2 weeks is better, once a week is best, but this is also why you need to be communicative with your audience.
Be consistent and dependable. We know a number of podcasts here, which are like, you probably know of them too, of like daily news podcasts every single day. You do need to keep in mind though that those often are either very simple and not very dynamic, or they have an entire team of 15 working, and they've been working on it for months before, which is why they can release like daily episodes as well. So don't put too much pressure on yourself in the very beginning, which is why something like seasons can really help. With us at Bear Radio, we always encourage you to do seasons because you get to then use your downtime effectively. If you've got 12 episodes coming out once a week, that gives you 12 weeks, and then potentially another 12 weeks off to start figuring out what you're going to do with your next season. Important though, don't do what we have both definitely done, which is kind of just like sit back, relax,
Vacation.
go to Portugal, and not use our time effectively. So make sure that you're looking at like repurposing content, maybe starting a blog, looking for new potential guests, looking at marketing options.
Your audience will forget about you if they don't hear from you for 3 months.
Yeah.
And we're going to be getting a lot more into seasons and podcasting formats in the next installment of Waves by Factory Berlin and Beats by Dr. Dre. I'm Jill Beytin.
I'm Julia Joubert.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.